The maitre d' had already turned away. He'd pointed her to the staff table, the narrow rectangular fold-out near the kitchen corridor, the one with the plastic chairs and the water pitcher with a crack along the handle, and moved on. Because in his 22 years of managing seating at the Harrington Club's formal dining room, he had developed the ability to look at a person and decide, in under 4 seconds, whether they belonged at the mahogany tables by the window or somewhere else. He had looked at Adaeze Nwosu and decided somewhere else. What he had not seen, what every person in that dining room would turn to witness 30 seconds later, was the French ambassador to the United States rising from the head table, crossing 40 feet of Persian carpet in full view of 200 guests, and pulling out the chair beside him with both hands. He did not summon her. He did not gesture. He walked to where she was standing with her clutch bag in her hand, and her face composed in the specific stillness of a woman who has been practicing this kind of patience since she was old enough to understand that the world would require it of her. He pulled out the chair. He waited. And the dining room of the Harrington Club, 140 years old, its walls hung with portraits of the men who had decided, across those 140 years, who was permitted to matter in rooms like this one, went completely, utterly silent. 7 years earlier, Adaeze Nwosu arrived in Washington with a diplomatic visa, a letter of appointment from the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a specific professional assignment that the ministry had described to her, with characteristic understatement, as complex. She was 34 years old. She had completed her undergraduate studies in international relations at the University of Lagos, her graduate work at the London School of Economics, and had spent 8 years in the Nigerian diplomatic service, moving through postings in Geneva, Nairobi, and Brussels, with a kind of record that did not require her supervisors to search for language when writing her evaluations. The language was always there, precise, thorough, possessed of the ability to read a room in multiple languages simultaneously. That last descriptor had appeared in 3 separate evaluations from 3 separate supervisors who had never met one another, which was the kind of evidence that meant something. Her assignment in Washington was trade negotiation support, which was the official title for a role that was in practice considerably broader. Nigeria was in the middle of a multi-party renegotiation of bilateral investment frameworks involving 4 countries and 2 international financial institutions, and the man nominally leading the Nigerian delegation, Deputy Minister Chukwuemeka Eze, 61 years old, a career diplomat of the old school who was universally respected and increasingly willing to acknowledge that the technical dimensions of modern trade architecture required someone whose fluency in that terrain was more current than his, had specifically requested Adaeze. He had worked with her in Brussels. He trusted her preparation and her judgment, which in his experience were 2 different things and rarely arrived in the same person. She found an apartment in Adams Morgan. She learned the city the way she learned every city she was posted to, on foot, in the early mornings before the day's demands began, covering different streets on different days until she understood the place at the level of texture rather than just geography. She identified the coffee shop with the best acoustics for phone calls, the park with the bench that caught afternoon light through the trees, the dry cleaner who pressed silk without overstating it. These details mattered to her not as pleasures, but as infrastructure. She was a person who operated well when her environment was thoroughly understood, and she extended that same discipline to her work. The trade negotiations were scheduled to begin in 10 weeks. She spent those 10 weeks reading, not the briefing documents, which she had read within 48 hours of the appointment. She read the secondary literature, the margin notes of the previous rounds, the public statements of the counterpart delegations cross-referenced against their voting records in international forums that most people assumed nobody was tracking. She built a picture of what each party actually wanted, which was always different from what each party said it wanted, And within that picture she began to see where the architecture of an agreement might actually stand, rather than where it was currently being proposed. Deputy Minister Eze called her 3 weeks before the negotiations opened and asked her to summarize her preparation. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes. He was silent for a moment afterward. Then he said, "You understand that you are not going to get credit for any of this." He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a mentor says the thing that needs to be said. She told him she was aware of that. He said good, because he needed her to know that her job was to make the delegation succeed, not to be seen succeeding. And that if she could maintain that distinction, she would find the work deeply satisfying, and if she could not, she would find it deeply frustrating. She told him she had spent 8 years maintaining that distinction. He said he knew. That was why he'd asked for her. The Harrington Club had been hosting diplomatic dinners since 1887. Its dining room was the kind of room that had made certain decisions so long ago that it no longer needed to announce them. The decisions were present in the materials, in the proportions, in the century and a half of portraiture on the walls depicting men of a very specific description doing the things that men of that description had always done in rooms that belonged to them. The club had technically opened its membership to women in 1994 and to non-white members in 2001, changes that had been made with the minimum of announcement and the maximum of the particular institutional inertia that ensures changes in policy do not necessarily produce changes in atmosphere. Adizi had attended 3 events at the Harrington Club in her first 2 years in Washington. She had been managed at each of them, directed, steered, positioned, in ways that were too smooth and too practiced to be accidental, but too deniable to be confronted directly. She had been introduced incorrectly twice, her title either omitted or softened into something vaguer. She had been seated at the periphery of tables where her presence was notionally included and practically marginal. She had watched these things happen and filed them in the specific internal record that professional women in her position maintain not out of grievance, but out of the practical necessity of knowing what a room is doing so you can operate within it accurately. She had not, at any of those 3 events, encountered the maitre d' at the door making a decision about her in under 4 seconds. That was new. That was the Harrington Club's annual Diplomatic Corps dinner, which was the most formally attended event on the Washington circuit this side of a White House state dinner, which was an event at which Adeze Nwosu had, 6 weeks prior, been seated 2 chairs from the Secretary of State. She had arrived at the Diplomatic Corps dinner on time, which in diplomatic terms meant 9 minutes early. She was wearing the dress she wore to events where she needed people to underestimate her, understated, impeccably cut. The kind of garment that reads as simple until someone who understands fabric looks at it more carefully. Her credentials were in the evening bag. Her invitation was confirmed. She presented herself at the entrance and told the maitre d' her name and title. He looked at her for 4 seconds. He told her the table arrangements had been finalized and directed her to the staff table near the kitchen corridor. She looked at him. She considered the 4 different ways she could respond to this, ranked them by effectiveness and long-term consequence, and chose the one that cost her the least dignity while giving him the clearest opportunity to correct himself. She said her name again. She said her title again. She said she believed she was listed on the formal seating arrangement. He said the arrangements were final, and that she could check with the event coordinator if she had a question. She picked up her clutch bag. She walked toward the staff table. She did not look around the room. She did not let her face do anything that would give him the satisfaction of having moved her. She was 3 steps from the fold-out table when she heard the sound. Not words. A movement. The specific sound of a chair being pushed back from a table in a room where every other surface was still. Ambassador Jean-Luc Marchand had been the French ambassador to the United States for 4 years. He was 67 years old, the product of the French diplomatic tradition at its most rigorous. A man who had served in 8 postings across 4 decades and who had developed, over those 4 decades, an allergy to a very specific category of social performance. The kind that used the language of protocol to do the work of exclusion. He had seen it in every country he'd served in. He had seen it wear many costumes. He recognized it without needing to analyze it, the way a person who has read the same sentence in many languages still knows what the sentence says. He had been watching the entrance. He watched entrances as a professional habit. You learned more about the actual power structure of a room from who arrived and how they were received than from any seating chart or briefing document. He had seen Adese Nwosu arrive. He knew who she was. Because he had been in rooms with her 3 times over the past 2 years, and because the Nigerian delegation's performance in the current trade round was, among the people who paid close attention to these things, a subject of considerable professional respect. And the name that came up repeatedly in those conversations was hers. He watched the maître de direct her to the staff table. He set down his wine glass. He said something to the man on his right, 1 word, an excuse, a placeholder, and he stood up. He crossed 40 feet of Persian carpet at the pace of a man who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. He walked to where Adese was standing near the fold-out table with her clutch bag in her hand, and her face arranged in the composure it had taken her 34 years to build. He pulled out the chair at the head table, the chair to his immediate right, the chair that had been set for a deputy chief of mission who had sent his regrets that afternoon. He said, in English accented with the particular music of a man who had learned it 3rd after French and Arabic, "Dr. Nwosu, please." He waited. She looked at him, not with surprise. She was not a woman who wore surprise on her face, but with the careful attention she brought to moments that were asking her to decide something quickly. She decided. She walked across the carpet and sat down in the chair he was holding. The room, which had gone still the moment he rose, remained still for another 3 seconds. Then it exhaled. 200 people in evening wear resuming their conversations, their movements, their wine glasses, all of them subtly recalibrated by what they'd just witnessed. The maître d' stood near the kitchen corridor for a moment, then moved away in the direction of the service entrance. Ambassador Marchand sat back down beside her. He did not make an announcement. He did not explain himself. He simply picked up his wine glass, turned to her, and said, "I understand your delegation has made significant progress on the Article 7 provisions. I'd like to hear your thinking." Adese set her evening bag on the table. She folded her hands. She began to speak. What happened in the next 90 minutes was not something that the other guests could fully hear, seated as they were across the width and breadth of a large formal dining room. But the people within range of the head table, 6 of them, including the Deputy Secretary of State for Economic Affairs and the trade representative from the European Commission, heard enough to understand that the woman the maître d' had directed to the staff table was conducting a real-time analysis of the current trade framework's structural weaknesses that neither of them had encountered in any briefing document they had received that year. She was not performing. That was the thing the Deputy Secretary later mentioned to a colleague. In the specific way you mention something when you're still processing it. There was no performance in it. She was simply thinking out loud in the way that people do when their thinking is clear enough to be spoken plainly, and the clarity of it had the quality of something that had been assembled over a very long time by someone who understood that preparation was not an advantage, but a form of respect. For the work, for the people across the table, for the stakes that were real even when the room around them was made of Persian carpet and mahogany, and portraits of men who had never imagined this conversation happening in their dining room. Ambassador Marchand asked questions. They were good questions, the kind that locate exactly where a framework is load-bearing and press there. And they met her answers squarely, and pushed, and she pushed back, and they arrived together, across the 90 minutes, at a framing for the Article 7 provisions that both of them recognized, without saying so directly, was better than what either delegation had been working with. By the time the dessert course arrived, 2 other ambassadors had repositioned their chairs toward the head table. By the time the evening formally concluded, the deputy secretary had asked Adaize for a working breakfast the following week. She gathered her evening bag. She thanked Ambassador Marchand. He said, in the tone of someone stating a matter of observable fact, that the thanks were entirely misplaced, that he had simply corrected a seating error, which was the kind of thing that occasionally needed correcting in rooms like this one, and that the evening had been the most substantively useful diplomatic dinner he had attended in his current posting, for which credit belonged entirely to her. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The error was useful. If he'd seated me correctly, I'd have been at the far end of the table talking to the assistant attached from Luxembourg." Marchand laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprises a person into it. He said she was probably right. She said she usually was. The Trade Framework Agreement was signed 7 months later. It was the first multilateral investment accord in the relevant sector to include the structural provisions in Article 7 that had been reformulated at the Harrington Club's Diplomatic Corps dinner, provisions which the official record attributed to collaborative development among the participating delegations. People who worked in trade policy and followed these things closely knew whose thinking was in those provisions. That knowledge traveled the way knowledge travels in professional communities, through the specific credibility that accumulates when a person is consistently, verifiably right about things that matter. Adaize was promoted within the Nigerian diplomatic service the following year. The appointment was to a senior advisory role that would have been described, in the ministry's characteristic understatement, as significant. It was the kind of role that had, until recently, been held exclusively by people whose path through the service had not included being directed to fold-out tables near kitchen corridors. She accepted it. She moved back to Abuja. She kept the apartment in Adams Morgan for the first 3 months, subletting it to a junior diplomat from a country she'd once been posted to, a young woman starting her first Washington assignment, whom Adaize met for coffee the week before the keys changed hands. She gave her 3 pieces of advice. The first was about the dry cleaner who handled silk, without oversteaming it. The second was about which briefing documents to read first, and which secondary literature mattered more. The third was about the Harrington Club. She said, when they seat you somewhere that isn't where you're supposed to be, remember that you are still in the room. Remember that being in the room is the thing they were trying to prevent, and they failed at that. The rest is logistics. The young woman wrote it down. Adaize watched her write it down and felt something that was not quite nostalgia and not quite pride. Something more precise than either. Something that had to do with the specific satisfaction of passing on the version of the truth that takes years to arrive at and that nobody hands you. Ambassador Marchand sent a note when he heard about the promotion. Handwritten, 3 sentences, on the letterhead of the French embassy. He said he was not surprised. He said the Article 7 provisions were already being cited in 2 subsequent negotiations he was aware of. He said he hoped they would work together again. She kept the note. She kept it in the same place she kept the photograph of the woman who had taught her to sit still in difficult rooms and wait for the moment when stillness became its own form of authority. Her grandmother, who had spent her whole life being directed to the wrong chairs, and had never once let it determine where she arrived. On the day she formally began the new role, she sat down at the desk that was now hers and opened the first file. The room around her was not made of Persian carpet and mahogany. It was a government office with fluorescent overhead lights and a window that looked out onto a parking structure. It did not matter. The work was in the file, and the file was in front of her, and she had long ago understood that the room was just the room. What she brought into it was the thing that counted. She opened the file. She began to read.